everybody, welcome back to Making the Game from Concept to Kickstarter. I'm your host, Reece, and in this podcast, we discuss the journey that we had of making our game Bloodthrone through the Kickstarter process, and it is still available on GameFound for anyone who wants to back it, giving all the insights that we learned and also discussing the ins and outs of our game. And in this episode, we will do a deep dive in designing the classes for the game, as that is a core part of what makes these kind of dungeon diver slash, RPG in a box type games fun. Last week, we discussed the lore and creative choices behind the heroes we selected, and that got a lot of good feedback. So I wanted to dive into the mechanics choices behind the class selection to discuss how we structured them to work within the context of the game and in conjunction with the other heroes. As this is a big topic and one I literally spent years on, the easiest way to approach this is to contextualize it with the example of a single class, fighter, and compare him to last week's example of the Dark Knight. Last week we used the example of Canthus, who is a Dark Knight from the Vespiary faction, to root the concepts. This week we will use the example of Ajax, a fighter from the Pan-Helios League faction, for the exact same purposes. Internally in testing, Ajax was the most popular character, not just because he looks absolutely awesome. Our partners at CreatureCaster really just hit it out of the park with his design, but because he was good on the tabletop and easy to use. When designing the fighter class, that was exactly what I was shooting for. The fighter is typically regarded, especially in RPGs, as sort of like the entry class. It's like the easy one to use. It's very straightforward. I actually started with the fighter as the first class to really formalize, as it is one of the most recognizable archetypes in tabletop gaming alongside the wizard and the rogue. Going all the way back to D&D Redbox when the fighter was actually called the Fighting Man. Fighter felt like a great choice to design first and kind of get everything settled down and use it as a comparison point for all other classes. So the proposition of designing the fighter class was both easy and difficult. For one, all of us know what a fighter is at first blush, but each of us is likely to have a different specific image come to mind. Perhaps you might see a Saxon-style warrior in chainmail with an axe and a sword or a shield, and another person might see more of a man-at-arms that's in full plate with a shield and a warhammer, etc. Me specifically, having absorbed tons of history and pop culture and played a lot of games, I always kind of thought of Mad Mardigan from Willow, Val Kilmer's character, as what I always thought of when I thought of a fighter. He can use a variety of weapons, he's very skilled, clearly he's had formal training, very pragmatic, brave, and has more of a grunt mentality than that of a noble knight, for example. He laughs at dirty jokes, doesn't care much for formalities, and he isn't above fighting dirty if it means he's going to win. Another great example that comes to my mind would be like Bronn of the Blackwater from Game of Thrones. Doing a great deal of research on the topic, what I found was that generally in gaming, what set a fighter apart from, say, a barbarian or a paladin or a knight or a ranger, sort of your traditional melee-oriented characters, was an emphasis on martial skill, pragmatism, no magical abilities, and a lack of any specific ethos other than to be good at what you do, enjoy life, and make money where you can. Contrast this to, say, a paladin, which generally has a more defined aesthetic of the sort of the white knight in shining armor. They stand for justice, they have a strict set of ethics, and some magical ability. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this rule in gaming, but that pretty much defines a paladin. It's what most of us would think of when we picture a paladin as opposed to a fighter. So a fighter is a trained professional warrior that probably served in a military or mercenary company as opposed to, say, a wild raging barbarian that perhaps had no formal training. Fighter has professional equipment, but is probably not as fancy as a paladin, which would likely have some sort of a patron or an institution supporting them. The fighter would also rely on skill and grit to win, right? So a little bit rougher around the edges. Now where we deviated from what I think would be the absolute prototypical fighter in regards to Bloodthrone is the way they work in context of the game itself. For context, say like in an RPG where your fighter can, do almost anything with a weapon, or I should say anything with any weapon, really. In Bloodthrone, you have 12 unique classes, and when you're building a party, you select 6 heroes which are available to you, and to even further specify, all the classes are broadly categorized into one of 3 archetypes: martial, skill-based, and arcane. We talked about this before, but just to recap really quickly, martial are your classes that fight physically, whether in melee or range. Skill classes have some sort of unique, cool ability, like an alchemist or an inquisitor, that defines them. They're more of a mix between martial and arcane, kind of conceptually, although they don't typically use magic. And then you have arcane, which are, your wizards like druids, clerics and things of that nature. When building a party, you select 2 of each archetype. So you'll end up with 2 martial, 2 skill, and 2 arcane. We did this as early in testing. We just said, take whatever you want, because we just wanted to see if anything was broken or whatever. But what we found is it quickly devolved into someone taking 6 fighters or 6 wizards or 6 bowmen or whatever. Maybe you toss in 1 healer for good measure, but it didn't always go that way. The restrictions kept coming until we got to 1 of each class, and further, they couldn't be all arcane or martial or skill-based. This made the game much more balanced, much more fun, and it reflected the nature of the lore of the game, in which every faction has been devastated, leaving a dearth of any specific class in their populations. So meaning, because everyone's gotten hit so hard during the events that occur before the current game state, there isn't a million wizards or whatever to draw on. Now, to further contextualize this, in the core game, you have basically the fantasy Dirty Dozen. It's a collection of heroes from all over the world of Chael that would never normally work together, but given the crisis they face, they set their differences aside. So half of them come from one of the 2 starting broad factions, and half come from the other. This also serves the purpose of letting players play PvP right out of the core box. It's a limited version of PvP, but you can do it. To recap the 2 broad factions for anyone who's joining us new to this episode, which by the way, welcome if you are. 1/2 of the world's remaining factions are broadly in a loose coalition called the Iconoclasts, and they condone the use of Devithae. Devithae, again, is stolen essence from sentient beings. The other half, the adherents to Zenith, forbid it. They all have their own reasons for making these choices, like, for example, some of them that use Devithae, which is a dirty resource, for lack of a better way to describe it. They may feel like they have to, or they may have to survive. And some of the factions that choose not to use it may be for purely pragmatic and not necessarily moral reasons. And as we move forward with the game and explore more of the lore, all of the reasons for this will become evident. And each faction has a pretty cool backstory, if I do say so myself, but we spent a lot of time on it. So when you select a mission to go on for that round of the campaign, whether it be PvE or PvP, you choose 6 of the available heroes within the restrictions above on class archetype. And again, some heroes will be injured or tired and they have to take a break. They will be unavailable for selection for a given round of a campaign. This forces you to always be mixing up your strategies, and it makes the game much more interesting for both PvE and PvP, as you're not simply repeating the same tactics over and over again. So if you risk a hero in the current mission, that hero may not be available for the next mission, so it forces you to think on a strategic and not only a tactical level. It also forces you to become familiar with all of the heroes and classes, and in testing, we found it to be one of the most enjoyable aspects of the game. So within that context, each class has a primary, secondary, and tertiary skill tree, which defines their role within the party and lays out the options you have for customizing that specific hero through the leveling process. There are other differentiating characteristics such as starting HP, starting bonuses, etc. to help further differentiate the classes. But that gives you kind of a broad sense of what makes, say, a fighter different from the warlord. Initially in design and testing, I envisioned the fighter as more of a jack of all trades, able to use any weapons, any armor. But within the context of that overarching structure that we just described, the fighter needed a more specific role. Also with game balance, what we found is that, for example, if everybody had the option to take a bow, smart players or power gamers or however you want to describe it would be like, oh, I'm going to take 6 guys with a bow. And you're like, well, that's not fun. They could all target the same enemy character and just pop 1 a turn. The conclusion that we drew in testing was fairly obvious, and it was like, okay, well, the fighter can serve as the party's tank, while also laying the smackdown in melee via DPS. So to this end, the fighter's primary skill tree is defensive. Their secondary skill tree is melee striking or melee DPS. Now for a bit more context, the tertiary skill tree for each class is there to add flavor to make that class feel unique. It's kind of like the extra cool thing they can do. For example, with the Paladin, their tertiary skill tree would be some form of magic. In this case, it's like healing and defensive buffs, etc. The tertiary skill tree also helps to fill the gaps for any important skill set a faction may be missing. Complexities of designing a game like Bloodthrone, which is a party-based, class-based system, is that each faction, you want them to feel different and unique, but also to not be missing any critical skill set that you need, like denial, for example, in Bloodthrone is extraordinarily important. In the core box, Inquisitor Calith has the denial abilities, but in another faction, an Inquisitor archetype may not fit the theme. So that skill tree, that ability to stop other players' special abilities needs to be worked in there somehow. And that's what all the different skill trees are there for. Specifically to the fighter, I decided that the best ability to give them was a very recognizable and useful skill. If you've played any kind of, especially MMOs or anything of that nature, it's Taunt. So not only does it fit the feel of the fighter, which is a sort of a gritty, rough around the edges fighting person, but it's also super useful for a class designed to absorb damage. The way taunting works in Bloodthrone, it's a short-ranged AoE shout action. So a shout action is a non-magical verbal action. So like a warlord, for example, would be issuing orders to the other party members. They would be using the shout action. So the fighter in this case just talks some really mean trash talk, and any of the opposing characters or enemies that are currently engaging the fighter that fail, that it is successful against, will be forced to fight the fighter when they activate next. So obviously it's a really powerful form of crowd control, and it really leans into what the fighter's trying to do, which is to be a bullet sponge for the rest of the party. Now, in contrast to this, Canthus, the Dark Knight, whom we discussed last week, he is the tank class for the Iconoclast side of the starting factions, which will become available in the hero expansion. So when you get the hero expansion, you get the remaining 6 heroes for each of the starting factions. 6 for the Iconoclast, 6 for the Adherence to Zenith. Ajax is the tank for the Adherence to Zenith. He's also obviously the tank for the characters in the core box. Canthus is the tank for the Iconoclasts. Canthus also has a crowd control themed skill tree as a tertiary skill tree. Now, just to be clear, the pairs of archetype classes typically do not have identical skill trees. I'll dive into that as we go through the classes in this podcast. But in this specific instance, they do. It just really fits for a tanky type archetype. So to differentiate between the Dark Knight and the fighter, the Dark Knight uses an ability called Get Over Here, which of course was in no way influenced by the game Mortal Kombat. But Canthus can use an action to pull a single enemy into melee range with him. As the Dark Knight is themed around a sort of anti-paladin feel, although not entirely, they are not innately evil by any means. They do have sort of an evil, Black Knight feel to them. So Ajax can hit a short AoE with crowd control, so it could potentially affect multiple enemies at a very short range. The Dark Knight has longer range and can pull a single key enemy into melee, which is it's really scary when you're playing the game. You're like, oh, I better not let my healer get anywhere near the Dark Knight. Further, as the Dark Knight does have a magical aspect to their class theme, similar to the Paladin, they have other abilities that are magical in nature, whereas the fighter, all of their abilities are based on skill, toughness, etc. They're non-metaphysical abilities. A fun note on the Dark Knight, since we're talking about it, their class is based around channeling their physical and emotional pain into power. So they have a special mechanic called pain tokens that they receive as they take damage. They use those pain tokens to fuel their metaphysical abilities. This creates a fun dilemma for your opponent, as the Dark Knight is a tank that they have to deal with, but they don't actually want to hurt it. So it just makes the Dark Knight stronger when they do. So it's a really fun dynamic that makes the Dark Knight feel unique. And on that note, a class ability is identical to other class skills available to all the various classes. But whereas a class skill is optional, so you have some available to you based on your level. You start out with 3 at level 1, and then every other level, you get another option for your class skills. The class ability is automatic. You always have it. It is meant to define the class, right? And so we'll go into these really quickly to give it context. So class skills, you have a number of choices based on your intelligence stat plus other modifiers. Class ability, you always have it. The fighter has a class ability called Untiring. Every turn when the fighter activates, they heal a small amount of HP. This is meant to represent their intense physical training and the disciplined manner in which they fight, preserving their endurance. By contrast, the Dark Knight has the pain token ability as their class ability. That's their defining ability. Untiring for the fighter is a very strong ability and is one of the reasons why everyone loved playing Ajax. Combined with his heavy armor, which reduces damage, we'll cover all the damage mechanics in a future episode, high starting HP, and his shield, which he can use to further reduce damage and block things, he's really just a bullet sponge. He's able to go right into the thick of the fight, take on all comers, and hit them back like a truck. Ajax specifically has maximum power of 4. Power is a reflection of physical or spiritual strength, being extraordinarily skilled, etc. For our purposes, though, in this specific example, you add power to most damage rolls. So Ajax is throwing in 4 more damage dice into every physical attack he does. So when he does connect with the enemy, he absolutely smacks the pants off of him. Again, to contrast this with the Dark Knight has an ability to enhance a melee attack with a pain token to do extra damage, and then to also absorb some of the HP from their opponent and use it to heal themselves for a small amount. If they throw extra pain tokens into this attack, they can increase the damage and the healing. So the more damage the Dark Knight is taking, the more deadly they become. Another class skill for the fighter, to show you more of what they can do, is a class skill called Into the Fray. This is a very popular choice for situations where you need the fighter to get stuck into melee as soon as possible and to also apply a powerful debuff to a key enemy. Specifically what this does, it allows the fighter to increase their movement and they smash into an opponent with their shield, applying a really powerful debuff called knockdown, which doesn't probably require any explanation, but basically it stuns the opponent and makes them more vulnerable. And as we have discussed previously, before each mission, you get to select the class skills you think are going to benefit you the most, limited by how many choices you have, in addition to your level, because you get more options as you level up, as I already said, and the options get more powerful as you go. And on a final note for the fighter, we decided to go with a mandatory shield for the fighter. So I went back and forth on this for ages, as I felt it was a restriction that perhaps didn't completely fit the core concept of the fighter, which we discussed earlier in this episode. But in the end, we felt it worked, as roughly half of the skills available to the fighter involved the use of a shield. And we really wanted to emphasize their tanky ability, make them unique, because again, in contrast to the Dark Knight does not have to take a shield. They can take a two-handed weapon, for example. The two, while both serving the role of tank, they are very unique, right? And so as we go through all the various factions, our goal is to have whatever the tank archetype is for each faction to feel unique, have perhaps some kind of a cool mechanic that they can lean into, perhaps have some sort of magical force field, or they are really good at parrying, or whatever the case may be, however we choose to implement that core tank concept. They all serve the same role, you know what to do with it, but they do it in a way that feels unique and true to the aesthetic of the faction. That, combined with the ability to assign stat points and choose equipment, means that one tank might be radically different than another. For example, in playtesting, I love to mess around with an elf fighter. Elves are faster than other heritages or races in our game for reasons that we explain in the lore. And I would have him wear no armor with a spear. A spear has reach, so he can engage people from further away, and a light shield. So it was like an anti-fighter, but he flew around the table. And my objective was to engage people from a flank where you have a bonus, or to go after like spellcasters and things of that nature. So it's really fun to get creative once you get your head wrapped around the core mechanics. And as an aside, sort of a designer's commentary, so to speak, the art on the cards, which there's an accompanying article coming to further dive into the fighter class, and I plan on doing one for every class in the game as we go. We decided to show sort of the most archetypal version of the class. So a lot of people might be playing and go, why isn't Ajax on all the cards? Because in the context of the core game, that would make sense. But the cards are designed to apply to any fighter in any context for any player. So we decided to go with art that reflected sort of like a generic fighter. What our vision of it is, you'll notice that they don't look like they're easily distinguishable from, say, a barbarian or a paladin, for example, or a Dark Knight. And we wanted to show the wide variety available in the world of Chael, which is the world of Bloodthrone. Some of them will be dwarves or humans or elves or whatever the case may be. I just wanted to add that note in case people were wondering why we made that choice. So Ajax specifically is a fighter from the Pan-Helios League, which is one of the factions in the game. They clearly have a Roman/Greek aesthetic, and Ajax himself is a race called Titanborn. They sort of have blood of ancient heroes running through their veins. So he's bigger. Kind of think, if you're familiar with the Warhammer universe, it'd be like a Stormcast Eternal or a Space Marine type figure. Not that, OP, but they're bigger and stronger, but not as agile as a human for comparison purposes. As stated, though, as you can make your own fighter with the hero expansion, you could, say, do a gnome fighter for whatever reason. Might not be the best choice, but it's definitely a choice you can make if you wanted to. Though ironically, as gnomes have a bonus to evasion. Evasion is the stat that functions in our game similar to the way armor class does in D&D. It actually wouldn't be a terrible choice. You'd be a little slow, but you can make an evasion tank with a gnome. So it is totally viable. It would also be really funny. So to sum it up, when we're designing the classes, especially like the fighter, we wanted to be able to give a sandbox to you as the player to come up with whatever concept you think was most fitting for your party. And also with the pre-made hero Ajax, we wanted a fighter that really emphasized the core concept. It's a character that can go into the thick of melee, take on all comers, punch them back, really hard to kill, little slow, doesn't have any really ranged attacks outside of his level 6 skill, which is throw shield, which gives him like a Captain America style ability to throw a shield off an enemy, do damage to him, bumps him to, moves him a little bit, and then bounce back to his hand, which is just fun. But if you can position Ajax or your own fighter to get in the right position to gunk up the opponents to get them all stuck on him, the rest of your party is free to do what they do best, right? And that's the overarching idea with the classes, and that's why we spent so much time testing things and trying to design each class to feel unique, have a clear role, but also have a lot of options for customization. Thank you as always for joining me for this episode of Making the Game. There's a lot more to say on just the fighter class alone, but hopefully this gives you an idea of the depth available to you as the player. We will speak to you all on next Friday, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.